Singapore is now the world's second most expensive data center construction market, with costs reaching 14.53 US dollars per watt. To help us understand the implications, we have Sumit Mukherjee of Turner Townsend. Sumit, what is driving overall cost increases in data center construction?
Look, I think that's a really good question. And the rise in construction costs in data centers that you speak to is principally being driven by the demand for AI-ready infrastructure in this sector. I think when you consider the acceleration of AI technology, the growth of sheer demand for AI computing, what we're seeing from a delivery standpoint is increasing pressure on the supply chain as it relates to things like power and cooling and general consumption required to deliver data center assets. The capacity of infrastructure that we have in place as part of data centers that are AI ready is significantly greater than what traditional data centers for computing and for enterprise client solutioning has been. And as a result of these factors, we're seeing significant increases in expenditure across the broader data center asset class. This is one of the fundamental factors which is driving up the cost increase. The other, I think, is sustainability. We are seeing rising costs in the data center space linked to very stringent sustainability requirements from markets. If you take Singapore as an example, the SS 715 standards, which calls for a 30% reduction in energy consumption, is one of those critical factors. And our clients, the operators and the providers of data center assets, are having to think more critically about more energy savvy resources, technology, equipment, plant, and other construction factors to drive those efficiencies. And that too is resulting in cost increases.
Now, why is power access becoming a critical differentiator for operators?
Well, I think power is a scarce resource in absolute terms. And I think when you combine power with the requirement at a policy level from governments, particularly in markets like Singapore, on sustainable power, on green power, it's a resource that requires careful planning and consideration. And of course, when you then overlay the demand factors that are coming from the AI infrastructure that I spoke to previously, what we're seeing is the need to plan for power much more carefully. Power availability in marketplaces which are mature, which have very specific policy requirements and controls, like in Singapore, will require clients and operators to plan 18, 9, 12 months ahead. And this is, again, a critical aspect for driving data center delivery. So power is a scarce resource, power linked to the demand factors from AI, whether it's cooling technologies, whether it's just the sheer consumption of the racks that are processing intelligence, and also some of those regulatory factors make power such a critical infrastructure resource for the DC sector.
Now, Sumit, what factors keep Singapore attractive despite high construction costs?
Look, I think Singapore is a blue chip market for data center clients, and I think there's several reasons behind that. I think first and foremost, it's a market that's truly sensational in terms of policy. It's a market which has been very stable from a policy perspective by government. It's a market which is very attractive for businesses, and of course, it's a market which has had significant economic impact across the ASEAN region. And I think for those factors, the data center investors are really keen on Singapore as a market to be hubbed out of. I think the second point is around Singapore's connectivity. Singapore is an incredible location for data center connectivity, and it's a nodal point for the region as a bit of a convergence point for critical DC infrastructure. And it's a market where, notwithstanding demand in markets alone, reticulation of data across the region tends to hub out of Singapore. And I think the third factor, which I find, the most interesting, is the sustainability aspects. And Singapore, again, linking it back to my earlier point around policy, is really market leading in terms of its ESG requirements. And if you look at some recent policy reforms that have happened in Singapore, the SS 715 ESG standards, for instance, it's putting an onus on our data center clients to think sustainably, to think for the long term, and to think for the environment. And when they think about their customers, which are global corporates, which are large-scale global institutions, who all have equivalent sustainability commitments, Singapore is a market where they can invest to demonstrate those commitments coming to life.
Thank you so much for sharing your insights with us, Sumit.
Thank you for having me.
Again, that was Sumit Mukherjee, Managing Director for Southeast Asia and Head of Real Estate for Asia at Turner and Townsend. For more news, please visit asianbusinessreview.com.